So ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome General H.R. McMaster.
And what an absolute privilege to be here at the Marine Corps Memorial, which I think it is the best memorial in any of the services because of the service it provides to Marines and families, a place to come together and celebrate what it means to be a Marine, what it means to serve in our armed forces, and not to just visit a monument where you're there for an amount of time to pay tribute to those who have gone before you and maybe honor some of your friends and fellow Marines or soldiers or airmen or sailors, but a place where you can really come together to celebrate really what it means to be able to serve our country. And thanks for the all too kind introduction. I mean, all of us know, any of us who have had the privilege of serving in our armed forces know that one of the benefits is that you have lots of people surrounding you who can compensate for your many deficiencies, and that has been true with me, certainly, throughout my career, in my professional life, and in my personal life as well, where Katie has done that for me on the home front. So I just want to tell you how happy I am to be here. I mean, this is one of my favorite places in the world. And I had the opportunity to visit here for the first time when I was at the Hoover Institution, and any chance that Katie and I had to come back, I mean, we're here, and we're members of the memorial, and it's a real privilege to be with all of you today. So I just wanted to say thank you for inviting me to speak tonight. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and I want to especially in the beginning, just right in the beginning, thank all of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and family members who either served in Iraq or Afghanistan, or who had family members serve in Afghanistan and in Iraq, both. And what I'd like to begin talking about is really what brought on these wars, and especially the war in Afghanistan in 2001. And of course, it's the murder of over 3,000 of our fellow American citizens. And it's funny because now when you talk to soldiers and Marines, you say, hey, when did you join and so forth? A lot of them were in grade school, when these attacks occurred. And that's what's so remarkable, I think, about their service today. Our fellow Marines, soldiers, airmen, sailors, is that they've all joined an armed force in time of war with really obviously no ambiguity at all that they were going to serve in harm's way. And of course, that memory of September 11th, 2001, it's etched indelibly in all of our memories. And since those attacks, we have been at war. And it is our servicemen and women, like the veterans we honor tonight, who courageously pursued the terrorists and mass murderers who committed those atrocities and pursued their allies as well. And we've been engaged really in an unprecedented war for really going on year 13 now in Afghanistan, with enemies who pose a grave threat not just to our nation, but really to all civilized peoples. And these wars, the wars in which you and your loved ones have served, I believe, are very poorly understood. And I think even today, most Americans don't really understand what is at stake. What is at stake in Iraq and the Middle East broadly, and in Afghanistan? And sometimes, there seems to be very little interest, despite the fact that we're at war, and little interest relative to stories ranging from Michael Jackson's death, if you remember how dominant that was, in the media, or maybe Kim Kardashian, who was remarkable only because of how unremarkable she is, or lately the Jodi Arias trial and so forth. So you just wonder really, what is at stake in Afghanistan and Iraq? Or many people ask, I think, that a lot of times, and I believe that the war in Afghanistan, the war that is ongoing today, is the most underreported war in American history. This even in the information age, when we should have greater access really to information and what's happening. And of course, the stakes in Afghanistan, in the Middle East today, are very high. And we are engaged with enemies in Central Asia and Afghanistan in particular, and in the Middle East, who really pose a threat to all civilized people, who want to murder our children and the children of all civilized people. And they use this irreligious ideology, it's irreligious, and we could talk more about that if you'd like afterwards, to perpetuate ignorance, and to use that ignorance to foment hatred, and then to use that hatred to justify the murder of innocent people. And I think these groups are particularly dangerous today because, in the past, maybe they would have been isolated. They would have been, in some remote place in the world, and they would be gripped with their ignorance and hatred but not really pose a threat except at the local level. Today, they're even more dangerous because they can communicate with each other. They can mobilize resources due to their ability to communicate with each other and to mobilize resources and gain access today and even more so in the future to destructive weapons. And we see this kind of connection in the most recent attacks in Boston as well. And these are really, I think, we ought to characterize them as criminal organizations. They want to pose as religious people, but they're irreligious criminals. And their ties to criminal organizations are explicit, and we understand those very well based on Zach Bookman is here from our task force in Afghanistan. That was our job, was to really map these organizations and understand the connections between terrorist and insurgent groups with transnational organized crime and the narcotics trade in particular. So these are people who say that they're religious, but really they're the largest criminal organization in the world. And this, of course, gives them access to financial assets to grow their capability for murder, intimidation, and oppression. And so the mass murder attacks against our own nation on September 11, 2001, and subsequent attacks on other nations and in other nations, including the United Kingdom, Spain, Libya, Mali, Nigeria, Pakistan, India, the failed attempts in Germany and so forth, and many other places, clearly demonstrate the importance of denying these transnational terrorist organizations access to the resources, freedom of movement, the safe havens, and the ideological space they need to plan, organize, and conduct these kind of attacks. Victory over our enemies, including Al-Qaeda and the various Taliban groups, it's inevitable. And we've already won, really. Because America has Marines, soldiers, airmen, and sailors, like those who we're honoring tonight, who will fight until freedom triumphs over this oppression. Today's generations of servicemen and women will triumph over these enemies as previous generations have triumphed triumphed over and defeated enemies associated with Nazi fascism, Japanese imperialism, and communist totalitarianism. And today's generations of servicemen and women have done something that really is unprecedented in our military history. They have not only fought our longest wars in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but they have done so as a volunteer force that represents a very small percentage of the population. And this is why this memorial is so important, because of where it is. And it helps connect our armed forces to the people in whose name we fight. And that is increasingly important because of this unique situation that we're in the scope of our history. So let's put this in context for a moment. At the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, America had an army, and I'm using army, because I'm in the army, but it's just a representative, okay? An army of 190,000. And of course, a very, very small Marine Corps at the time. During World War II, that number grew to an army of 8.5 million. That's a 44-fold increase. A total of 16 million Americans served in uniform in World War II. And that's virtually every family had somebody in harm's way. And that army, just the army of 8.5 million, existed in a country with a population of about 130 million at the time. Now, by contrast, our army today is about 500,000. It's going to go down to 490,000, maybe lower based on budget issues, and we can talk about that. But in a country of 307 million, so 500,000, 490,000 in a country of 307 million. So I think today, Winston Churchill's quotation about the British Air Corps during the Battle of Britain seems particularly appropriate. Never have so many owed so much to so few. And so I think it's important for us to stay connected with what our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines are doing in Iraq, I mean, in the Middle East broadly, in the wake of Iraq, and in Afghanistan in particular. And in particular, I think what we have to try to understand are the stakes. What is at stake? And then also to understand what the prospects are for success and winning in war. And so that's what I'd like to talk about just briefly. You know, in Afghanistan, the stakes are high. And the stakes are high because we are fighting these enemies who are connected to these transnational terrorist organizations. There have been some who have tried to say, well, you know, the Taliban, you know, they're really misunderstood. Maybe we can bring them in to the political settlement, which I think that's a policy decision. I'm glad that we're doing that, but I think we ought to not have any delusions about, you know, really what that means and what the Taliban stand for, and their connections to terrorist organizations are pretty clear. There are three main Taliban groups in Afghanistan who are enjoying safe haven support bases in Pakistan. The first of these is Hezb Islami Gulbuddin, and these are the ones who just took responsibility, you know, for a mass murder attack in Kabul. And this is the group that's particularly adept at political subversion of the Afghan state through existing state institutions and functions. And the second group is the Haqqani Network. The Haqqani Network, their principal tactic is the mass murder of innocent people. I mean, they're responsible for the biggest car bombs and that sort of thing in Afghanistan. And the final group is the Quetta-Shor Taliban. It's led by Mullah Omar. Now, if you think about that, for how many people, and this is not, I mean, it's not a criticism in any way, how many people have not heard about that breakdown of the groups we're fighting, right? Now, in World War II, how much ambiguity was there in terms of who we're fighting, though? There really wasn't much ambiguity, was there? So we don't really even understand who we're fighting. And if we don't understand who we're fighting, how can we understand the stakes that are involved? And I would say that this is sort of a symptom of what I would call an almost narcissistic approach to war. We define the war and we define international security largely only in relation to us. And we don't recognize that this is a competition really between civilized people, and us in particular, and enemies who are placing our vital interests, our humanity, our liberty, and our freedom at risk. And so I think the first step is understanding the enemy, understanding these groups and what they do, what they stand for. And I think it's particularly important to read what they write and what they say, because they mean what they write and what they say. Much like Hitler did in Mein Kampf, when we didn't pay attention to that, and the civilized world didn't pay attention to that. So I think it's really important that we listen to them and we look at what they do and who they are. And in particular, I would just highlight the fact that these groups are not only criminal organizations, as I described, but they commit child abuse on an industrial scale. And so these organizations who we're fighting control these religious schools, so-called, they're really irreligious schools, in Pakistan. And they recruit teenagers and they recruit adolescents, people who are seeking affirmation, people who need food, shelter, who have no other educational option, and they systematically brainwash them. They engage in the worst abuse of these children, often sexual abuse, and then they mobilize them to be employed in Afghanistan to pursue what are really, a political objective for each of these groups in Afghanistan, and their connection, obviously, to transnational terrorist organizations, Al-Qaeda in particular, and their connection, unfortunately, to foreign intelligence organizations as well. So in Afghanistan, the stakes are high. This is really the frontier of civilization. And the enemy is at the gates there on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so what has to happen for us to be able to win? And I say win deliberately. I think one of the things that we have done in recent years is we undervalue victory, right? So we don't think in terms of war and warfare as being a competition between us and a determined enemy. An enemy we have to defeat their will and defeat their capabilities. So the four things that have to happen is, first, the defeat of the Taliban. And I think it's okay to say defeat. And defeat means that the enemy can no longer effectively pursue their strategy. And we might as well do it because we did go all that way, to Afghanistan. So while we're there, let's, defeat the enemy. And defeating that enemy, it has to occur on the physical battleground, as it has, in particular, in the last several years in southern Afghanistan, with the heroic work that our Marines have done in Helmand, that our soldiers and Marines have done throughout the South and in the East. But we have to operate on multiple battlegrounds to defeat the enemy. And those battlegrounds include the battleground of state institutions and functions. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But also the battleground of perception as well. If you think about war and the continuities in war and warfare, really there are four, I think, main key continuities. The first is war is an extension of politics. So we fight wars to achieve a sustainable political outcome consistent with our vital interests. The second is war is profoundly human and involves tribal, ethnic, cultural, psychological dynamics that really defy any kind of way of predicting the future and demand that we operate effectively on land in particular. The third, I think, continuity in war and warfare is that war is a contest of wills, and we're talking about that a little bit here as well, and the fourth is the future course of events of war is unpredictable, and so we have to be prepared for unforeseen events, circumstances, demands, and so forth, and I think that those continuities are often neglected. So defeating the Taliban, though, is the first of the four things we have to do in Afghanistan. And that's really ensuring they can no longer effectively pursue their strategy. And if you think about why did the Taliban collapse, the Taliban regime collapsed in 2001, it was mainly because every Afghan was convinced of the inevitability of their defeat, right? I mean, we had some very important physical effects against enemy organizations, but really the main victory was a psychological victory. And so what are we doing today? What do we do now to convey that kind of determination in this contest of wills that is war? The second thing is that we really need to harden the Afghan state, help harden the Afghan state and its security forces against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban, which lies across the border in Pakistan. And this has a lot to do with really consolidating gains, strengthening Afghan institutions. Afghan institutions are infiltrated and subverted by criminal organizations. We could talk more about that if you'd like. And so it's important then to really strengthen those institutions. The third key thing that has to happen is Pakistan's behavior has to be supportive of moving Afghanistan towards security and stability. That's a diplomatic function. And the third thing is international support has to be sustained for Afghanistan. And as I said, we've already won. So, but really we need to take whatever actions we can to consolidate the gains we've made and to make sure we don't have a more difficult course in the future. So what this requires from us, I think, is confidence and will. And despite difficult problems, I mean, there are reasons to be confident in Afghanistan. There's a growing civil society movement, in a country that really had zero cell phones, no communication with the world. You can't run and bump into any Afghan without a cell phone now. Zach, what is it, like 8 million, I think, cell phone? I mean, but same thing with education and women's education in particular. There's been all sorts of advancements in infrastructure development and so forth. So the enemies of the Afghan state are these criminal organizations that I think we have to portray as criminals, and we have to focus on these four key tasks. So, how about Iraq? Well, in Iraq, the situation today is bad, but it would have been a lot worse if we hadn't adapted to what frankly were unforeseen problems in the war in Iraq at its outset. And that in particular has to do with the so-called surge. And when you see Gentili, I disagree vehemently with him, on his interpretation. But really, that reinforced security effort in 2006 to 2007 broke a cycle of sectarian violence and gave Iraq a chance to move towards sustainable security and stability. But of course, in the Middle East, there are a lot of interconnected difficulties today. And the problem in Iraq is connected to the civil war in Syria, which has killed probably about 90,000 people in Syria in the last year and a half, 2 years. 2 years, I guess, now. And that war has become a sectarian civil war, an element of that, with an oppressive regime. But also, it has a lot to do with the activities of outside powers and the role that they're playing inside of Syria. And this is really, I think, instructive to us, understanding the situation in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in northern Nigeria, in Yemen, in Mali, what happened recently. There is a great deal of continuity between those conflicts at a high level of generality. And I think it's important for us to understand how our enemies operate. What they basically do, and what they're doing in Iraq today, is they try to pit communities against each other, get people to fight each other along religious lines, tribal lines, and then what these terrorist organizations do is they come in and portray themselves as patrons and protectors of one of the aggrieved parties in this conflict. And then they use that foot in the door to establish control over those populations and over territory. And they perpetuate violence, typically through mass murder attacks and assassinations, and as they destroy the social order at the local level and impose their narrow, irreligious ideology on the people. And we have seen this cycle in all of the places I've mentioned and even more. And so what you see this at the local level, you see this at the national level. And so what's important for us, I think, to understand about Iraq is that we did stop the sectarian civil war there. A civil war that threatened our interests and also threatened to destabilize the entire region. What we need to do now, we could talk about maybe in Q&A in terms of Iraq and the way ahead. But what we saw is, and I'm sure all of you who served in Anbar province here in the Marine Corps saw this kind of cycle of violence as it occurred really on tribal lines, and we saw it in sectarian and ethnic lines in other parts of the country. But to honor those who served both in Iraq and Afghanistan, I'd like to share with you the words from a letter that was written from the mayor of Tal Afar, Iraq, in 2006 to the soldiers of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment. This is a city that had become the main base for Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. The city was held hostage in the hands of his henchmen. These people came in, they murdered the imams in the mosques, and this is great evidence of why these are irreligious people. They put people with 3rd and 4th grade educations in charge of these mosques. They turned them into really torture cells and brainwashing cells. They closed all the schools, all the government services and businesses. Streets were silent, markets were closed, people lived in fear. Death awaited them around every corner, and it was a city that was gripped, by savagery. And this, I think, what he wrote to our regiment as we departed Tal Afar could have been written to any of our organizations, Marine and Army organizations, who fought in Iraq, who broke that cycle of violence, and who helped give hope to communities who had been devoid of hope. He wrote, "God bless the families who dedicated these brave men and women. From the bottom of our hearts, we thank the families. They have given us something we will never forget. To the families of those who have given their holy blood for our land, we all bow to you in reverence to the souls of your loved ones. Their sacrifice was not in vain. They are not dead, but alive, and their souls are hovering around us every minute, every second of every minute. They will never be forgotten for giving their precious lives. They have sacrificed that which is most valuable. We see them in the smile of every child and in every flower growing in this land. Let America, their families, and the world be proud of their sacrifice for humanity and life. So if you've ever doubted the positive impact of our Iraq and Afghanistan veterans, I think this letter speaks for itself. It's unfortunate you don't often hear that in the media, and you don't understand the effect that our soldiers and our Marines in particular, alongside other servicemen and women, are having and have had in both countries. It was the courage, the toughness, but also the compassion of our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines that allowed us to defeat the enemy in these conflicts, defeat their campaign of intimidation and coercion, and bring life back to these areas. And I don't know how many Marines here have served in Helmand in the last, maybe since 2010. Anybody since 2010? All right, so you saw that dramatically in Helmand as well. So your actions have made a real difference in real people's lives, and you sent a clear message as well to our enemies who I think we ought to study and understand, that America cannot and will not be intimidated. So fighting these wars as fighting any war has obviously taken its toll, and I love the memorial that you've got here, General Myatt, for our fallen soldiers and Marines and airmen and sailors. But many people, I think, look at military service and they see those sacrifices in sort of in a way that they maybe don't fully understand. But I think what Americans typically misunderstand the most, or don't understand really enough, are the rewards of service in our military. And of course, all of us who have had the privilege of serving in our military understand these intangible rewards, knowing that you're making a difference in an endeavor greater than yourselves, knowing that you're part of a team, a family really, in which the man or woman next to you is willing to give everything, including their own lives, for you. You and your fellow Marines, soldiers, airmen, sailors have made sacrifices to bring freedom and security to people in faraway lands. You have lived and exemplified the values that define our nation, our armed forces, and our way of life. These values include freedom especially from fear, respect and compassion for our fellow people regardless of race, nationality, religion, or ideological predilection, courage to protect the weak and defenseless and confront those terrorists who are the enemies of all civilized people, and love so strong that you're willing to give your own lives for your fellow troops. Veterans, you've answered your nation's call to service at a time when our nation was committed to 2 wars. You knew that you would serve in combat. You have secured our fellow Americans and our way of life. I am proud of your service, grateful for your service, and grateful for the opportunity to have served alongside you. You know, generals, and General Myatt will agree with me on this, I know, generals are not heroes, but we have a great job because we have the privilege of serving alongside heroes like you. So veterans, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be in the company of you, to be in the company of heroes tonight. And I also want to thank your families. I want to thank your spouses. I want to thank your parents. I want to thank your sons and your daughters for the support that has allowed you to serve. And to those families who've lost our soldiers, sailors, airmen, your soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in these wars, I want you to know that you remain in our thoughts and prayers. I want you to know that we will never forget your loved ones. I want you to know that those of us who continue to serve are resolved to live well, to cherish their memories, and also to cherish the freedoms that they fought to preserve. So thank you so much for the privilege of being with you, and I'm happy to hear wherever you'd like to take the discussion. Thank you.
We're truly blessed to have you with us tonight, General McMaster. But before we go to the question and answer period, and you mentioned the sacrifices some of these youngsters have made, we do have with us tonight a Gold Star mother, Yolanda Vega. I'd like you to stand up here. Two Gold Star mothers. Stand up, both of y'all, for your sacrifice. There's such an interesting group of questions I have here, and I've really divided them up into 4 categories. And I was a little surprised by the first category. I'm really going to talk about things going on at home here, Iraq, Afghanistan, and then a lot of questions deal with your dereliction of duty, interesting enough. In the home category, and I had somebody come up and he dropped this off here, and I think there are really several questions that concern with the attitude of the American people. How do we psyops our own people? How do we mobilize our own ideology? And then another one said, you made a comparison between World War II and the conflicts we've recently engaged in. The American people know little. How do we inform the public more? How do we get them on our side? That question.
Well, I think one of the key organizations that can do this is the Marine Corps Memorial and others. I mean, our military can't do this, as you guys know. I mean, it's not our role, right? I mean, nobody elects generals to influence policy, right? No, right? There's no, and for us to really advocate for, to really try to influence public sentiment or even a heavy-handed approach to public education, I think, could undermine civil control of the military under the Constitution of the United States. So our job is really to fight. Our job, I think, as leaders, is to explain. I think it's completely appropriate for serving officers and non-commissioned officers to explain the stakes whenever they can. Here's what's at stake. Here's who I'm fighting, and then also to help Americans understand how military operations and efforts are contributing to the achievement of an aim that is worthy of their soldiers, Marines, airmen, and sailors' sacrifices, right? So I think that is appropriate. But our role, I think, is to provide our best advice, mainly inside of the chain of command, and not to cross the line between advice and advocacy for policy. So in terms of public, really the public's understanding of the wars and how to improve that, I think it has to come from the public. Now, the information is out there. I mean, there's some great websites, about Afghanistan and about what's going on in Iraq. I mean, there's a Center for Combating Terrorism at West Point that puts out a Sentinel report once a month. It's really good on terrorism. There's the Institute for the Study of War is an exceptional organization that does great analytic work, for example. But you have to really dig to find it. It's not in the popular media. And I think that there has to be some sort of incentive for the media to cover international security and these wars in particular more comprehensively and to get it out there. That incentive would be a demand from the public for that information. And that demand would lead to an effective business model to do it. It's much cheaper for CNN to have Piers Morgan talk to Kim Kardashian or whatever, you know what I mean? Because that doesn't cost any money. You're not deploying anybody to a combat zone. You're not paying insurance for the reporters who are going there, and so it's cheap. It keeps the American people happy apparently, right? So I think it's on the demand side is what has to change. And I'll tell you, I have so much respect for war reporters. I mean, they're tremendous reporters out there who take great risks. But it's really the people that have to are the owners, the editors. They're the ones who have to recognize that the American public want to understand, really, the wars that their sons and daughters are fighting, and that's I think the biggest part of it is the demand side.
Continuing with the home category here, there's several questions on sequestration and the impact that sequestration will have on our objectives in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Right. I'm not the right guy to talk about that, and obviously I think the hardest part about sequestration and also the continuing resolution, the whole budget situation broadly, and what's difficult for our senior leaders in the Army, way above my level, is the lack of predictability. So once you understand what the budget constraints are going to be, you can plan to do your best to deliver the best Army, Marine Corps, Navy, Air Force capability that we can. But now it's really difficult to determine really what resources are going to be available for our military. I will say that I think it's very important that we have a debate about really the nature of threats to our national security and what type of military we need to deal with those threats. And the tendency, of course, that we've seen even in other interwar periods, and we're not in an interwar period, we're still at war. We have over 60,000 troopers in Afghanistan right now, but even just in anticipation of peacetime, because we want it to be peacetime, some people, are just assuming that we're going to be there, that we tend to really develop, I think, what are fallacies about the nature of future war that give us easy solutions to our budget problem. So I think today there are maybe 4 big fallacies or so that you hear about the nature of future war or threats to national security. And the first of those is that, and this is an old one, this is that we can solve the problem of future war mainly by the application of power onto land from the aerospace and the maritime domains. And this is strategic bombing theory that goes back to the 1920s and an Italian bombing theorist named Douay. And it just keeps coming back. It's like a vampire, it comes back every 10 years or whatever. I mean, no matter when you kill it. The last manifestation of this was the revolution in military affairs, orthodoxy in the 1990s. Future war would be fast, cheap, efficient, right? You had terms like shock and awe, right? Rapid, decisive operations. Like, how can you be against that? I mean, you can't be for ponderous, indecisive operations. You have dominant battle space knowledge. I mean, all these hubristic, unrealistic terms. And remember, future war is going to be fast, cheap, efficient. It's one of the reasons why we had so many difficulties in Iraq and Afghanistan, is we went to war in both places, having bought in large measure, to these unrealistic visions of future war. And so we were unprepared by the reality of war. So these people are now, what you hear is the same thing you hear all the time. Hey, believe me, this time, the next war is going to be really completely different from all wars that have come before it. So I think we neglect really continuities in war in favor of this idea. It's going to change, it's going to make it easy for us. The second is the human dimension of war. That war is a profoundly human endeavor. And this is one of the reasons why war is on land, but the fallacy besides really, the application of power onto land from the aerospace and maritime domains. This is air-sea battle. Some of the aspects of it, which I'm all for. I mean, we need air-sea battle, but it's not a strategy. It's a capability we need in context of a broader strategic approach to war. The second thing that we hear a lot of times now is that basically what we need is a global SWAT team. This might be the zero dark 30 strategy, right? So based on the enemies that we're fighting, we just need to conduct raids. And this raiding mentality, then you can just have really highly trained special operations forces. That's all you need for defense. And that would be cheaper and more efficient. The third fallacy is we can just outsource the war to partners across the globe, right? So all we just need to do is to advise other people, and they'll do our fighting on land, in particular for us. And of course, this bumps up against the continuity of wars as a continuation of politics, right? We tried to outsource the war prematurely to Iraqis, and we supported an Iraqi Ministry of Interior and forces that had become party to a sectarian civil war and had been largely captured by the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps of Iran. And we were organizing, training, equipping, and advising them as that civil war grew in scale. We've seen that with aspects. Why did the Kandahar police force, well, was it terrible for 10 years? I mean, was it because we didn't train them, we didn't equip them, we didn't advise them? It's because they were infiltrated and subverted by the Taliban. Why did the Malian armed forces, who we trained, defect to an Al-Qaeda associated group? Because their interests weren't congruent with ours. So we have to have the capability, because we have global interests, to do our own fighting on land where people live. So what I'm concerned about the budget is that there will be these justifications for a strategic approach to the problem of future war that are based on really wars we would like it to be rather than war as it really is.
I really like that answer because it also addressed the next question I have, and I can shorten the question a bit, but there was about 4 of you that asked about the future of special operations, and they see that the Army's being cut, the Marine Corps is being cut. Nobody's cutting special forces, they're adding special forces. So what is the future for special forces in these wars?
Well, I think the future is really bright and for special forces, and it's a tremendously important capability across all of our services, and the reason for that is that really it's hard to envision a conflict in which it will not be a multinational conflict, that we won't be operating alongside and with indigenous forces of some kind, and that we won't really have the need to integrate special forces in really 2 key roles, which is foreign internal defense to build up their defense capabilities, and combat advisory roles. I think the role of special forces in unconventional warfare is still as important as ever, and still as important as ever in their strategic reconnaissance role as well. So I am all for the special forces capabilities we have and are developing, but I think that what we really need to do is ensure that we integrate special forces and conventional force capability, and we recognize the capabilities, but also the limitations of both forces. And some of those are the ones I mentioned in terms of the political dimension of war, and so I think that obviously any conflict of any scale is going to take more than just advisors with indigenous forces who oftentimes aren't as capable. I mean, there's a Navy analogy to this as well. I mean, remember years ago when we were concerned about oil smuggling off Nigeria, and so we thought, oh man, we just need to work with that Nigerian Navy, make them more capable. And then we realized, well, after we built up the Nigerian Navy's capability, they were the ones smuggling the oil. So I think it's really important for us, I think, to recognize the limitations, to really build special force capability, but recognize the limitations of what can be accomplished by, with, and through partners, proxies, and so forth.
I want to switch now to the other areas, and Iraq is the first area, and there's a question here. The U.S. left Iraq with no presence. What is your prognosis for Iraq today in view of the Sunni Shiite animosity?
Well, it's going to depend on Iraqis now, obviously in large measure, and obviously what we can do to help Iraq maintain stability and not descend back into large-scale sectarian civil war, which is a very significant danger now. One of the key things I think that we have to be able to do as a military, I think our Army just defines this pretty well. We say we have 2 fundamental competencies. One is combined arms maneuver, and that's maneuver to seize, retain, and exploit the initiative over the enemy, essentially to defeat enemy organizations. And then the second thing that we have to be able to do is we have to set security conditions, what we call wide area security, so that we can consolidate gains and achieve sustainable outcomes consistent with our interests and worthy of the sacrifices that we've made in this war. I think that the problem that we've had both in Iraq and in Afghanistan is a difficulty in consolidating gains. And those gains have to be consolidated physically from a security perspective, as our Marines are doing, for example, now in Helmand, as 3rd Infantry Division is doing with their forces in Kandahar, obviously much heavier reliance on Afghan forces and so forth. But they also have to be consolidated politically. They have to be consolidated in the area of rule of law. They have to be consolidated in the area of really military support to governance. And our military, Marine Corps and the Army in particular, have always had to do this, always. And then what happens is, we come out of a war like this and say, man, that's the hard part. We don't want to do that anymore. And then we just assume we're not going to have to do it anymore. We've always had to undertake the broad range of activities as part of civil military teams to consolidate gains and achieve those sustainable outcomes. In Iraq, we had a mixed record in doing that. And a lot of that has to do with our difficulty in operating on battlegrounds other than the physical battleground. And we are, for our military, I mean, for sure, I mean, that's what we do, right? The physical battleground. But our enemies operate on multiple battlegrounds. They operate on battlegrounds within state institutions and functions, a political battleground, a criminal battleground. They also operate very effectively on the battleground of perception. And in Iraq, these militias associated with really a Shia Islamist agenda in particular and associated with the Iranians infiltrated and subverted key state institutions and undermined the status of forces agreement and so forth, but also undermined the political settlement there. Ayad Alawi won the election. And then a judge ruled that it's not the party that wins the election that gets the first crack at forming the government, parliamentary government. It's the party that's in power now. It's crazy. That was unconstitutional. There's nothing in the Iraqi constitution about that. But that was the Iranian agenda, and they were able to carry that out through the judiciary in Iraq. And how effective were we at countering that subversion by the Iranians? Not effective enough, apparently, right? So the capture of the Iraqi state by parties who were pursuing a narrow, particularistic agenda that's compatible with the Iranians undermined the political settlement. And the political settlement in Iraq was critical because people had concluded, based on our efforts to broker political accommodations at the local and national level, they concluded they could advance their interests best through the political process rather than through violence. But after that election and the aftermath, and after the latest problems with elections being suspended, the attacks that you've seen, both Shia on Sunni, Sunni on Shia, from extremists in both camps who are trying to jumpstart again large-scale sectarian violence, Iraq is in a very difficult position. It's in a difficult position because of this reason, the Shia-Sunni issue, but also because of the Kurd-Arab issue associated with the oil-rich regions in the north in particular, and because of the potential for bleed over of the conflict from Syria. So I'm very concerned about Iraq. Iraq does have some really good things going for it. I mean, courageous Iraqis that we serve with, many of us. But it's really going to take a huge diplomatic effort, I think, on the international community's part to hold Iraq together, prevent it from descending into large-scale sectarian and ethnic violence like we saw in 2006.
I'm glad we're recording this because that's a lecture on the situation in Iraq that we want to be able to watch and watch again. I think that was very good. I appreciate that, and I agree with that, by the way, which I guess makes me as smart as him. But that was great. I want to switch to Afghanistan because we're going to run out of time, and your most recent tour has been in Afghanistan, and you dealt with corruption. A couple questions on corruption. What is the prospect for Afghanistan and the government in Afghanistan with the corruption that you observed?
Well, again, this is an area that's going to take strong Afghan leadership, but it's also going to take political will on their part and political will on our part, I think, as well, to help incentivize and encourage the kind of reforms that are necessary. The problem of corruption and organized crime in in Afghanistan, is tied to their recent history. This is a traumatized society. It's a society that's been at war since 1978 during the Sour Revolution, was at war during the resistance to the Soviet occupation in the 1980s, experienced a destructive civil war from April 1992 to 1996, and then was subjected to the brutality of the Taliban regime, which destroyed any institutions we would recognize. Institutions especially involving law enforcement, rule of law, governance, and so forth. And so when we went in under this idea, of the revolution in military affairs, fast, cheap, efficient, quick, light footprint, and so forth, we toppled the Taliban regime, but we didn't really do a good job of answering the question of, okay, so what comes next? And how do we shape what comes next? So the parties that had been involved in this 30-year war, those that were opposed to the Taliban moved in and formed these nascent state institutions. These are militias that essentially effected state capture from the ground up. So, for example, you have the Shor Nazar, the Northern Alliance, associated with the first vice president and others who controlled the Ministry of Defense. And they still control the military of defense, and in large measure. These groups have engaged in activity that has morphed, I think, in large measure, these organizations from militias to organized crime networks. And they're organized crime networks that are pursuing criminal agendas, because there are individuals that are in these networks, which is, making money and economic motives. But they're also pursuing a political agenda, which is mainly to consolidate power in advance of a post-ISAF, U.S. and allies, Afghanistan. And why they're doing this is because they don't have faith in a long-term vision for the future of Afghanistan in which they believe their interests will be advanced and protected. So this is a short-term maximization of gains mentality. To put it crudely, get as much milk out of the international cow as you can as it wanders across the Afghan plain for the last time, right? And build up that power base. You're in the best position of advantage. So how do you begin to take on this problem? Well, I think the first thing is to understand it, to understand that these are organized crime networks that are pursuing a political agenda, what we call criminalized or criminal patronage networks. And then to work with Afghans, courageous Afghans who want a better future for their country, to help them understand that it's in their interest to take on this problem. And to do that by exerting influence effectively through cooperative means, common understanding, right? To lead to common action, to persuasive means, which is, I think, using incentives associated with conditionality of assistance. And then the third is coercive means. Many of these networks are connected to transnational organized crimes networks. There are all sorts of things we can do to impose sanctions on them: travel restrictions, visa bans, targeted economic sanctions. We have to do a better job, I think, of understanding where these organized crime networks and criminals, the criminal underworld, where they're connected to the political and business upper world, and to begin to sever some of those ties. And really what we have to be able to do is help Afghans insulate state institutions and functions that are critical to the state's survival from these networks enough so they can gain strength over time and the state can survive. We don't need to turn Afghanistan, or Afghans don't need to turn into Switzerland, but we do have to reduce the threat of corruption and organized crime enough so the state can survive. Can we do that? Yes. There are a lot of fallacies out there about the problem. Afghans are not inherently corrupt. In fact, quite the opposite is the case in terms of their culture. And I think we have to have a better understanding of the problem as the basis for this. We are doing a lot of this work, obviously, now. I think there are some critical events coming up. The election in March of 2014 is huge in Afghanistan. Will that election be regarded broadly as legitimate or legitimate enough by each of the segments of the population? And will they believe that the government that is formed as a result of that election can advance their interests through politics rather than through violence? It's a really key milestone for the Afghan people. I think that we should answer some key questions along with Afghans. Ask questions. Afghans should ask these questions. Do you want a political settlement in 2014 that is more or less reliant on the Mujahideen era elites who are running the country now? And I think one of the benefits, one of the good things in Afghanistan now is there is a big civil society movement that is multi-ethnic, that is reform-minded, that is frankly pro-Western, anti-Taliban / criminal. So I think fostering those kind of sentiments are key, and supporting those who want to see a better future for the country. So I think, I oftentimes think about General Grant. General Grant was an amazing guy, and in his first major battle in the West, he's in the rear area, and there's just panic in the rear, and he sees all the casualties, he sees mayhem, in the rear area, and when he gets to the front, he meets General Sherman. The situation's calm, and Sherman's in control, and they're in a strong position relative to the enemy. And in his memoir, he writes something like this years later. He said, "The distant rear of an army is not the best place from which to judge what is going on in front." And I think in Afghanistan, you know, it's easy to become pessimistic the further away you are. I think once you're there, you can see you see the difficulties, and there's huge difficulties, but you can also see the possibilities.
Well, thank you, and I want to end here with the part I promised some of these. It's your experience with your research on dereliction of duty, and for many here, Tom Ricks wrote a book called The Generals, and he was rather critical of some of our recent generals, and the question was, what did you think of Tom Ricks' book, The Generals?
Right. Well, thanks for that, sir. You know, the thing, I'm just going to have a glass of wine. I'm going to just grab my wine. No, you know, I mean, all of us in the military, we've got respect for Tom Ricks. He does a great job, and he sparks a lot of debate and so forth. But you know, really, the worst thing that can happen to you in the Army or Marine Corps is to receive praise from Tom Ricks. I mean, that's the worst thing. That's the worst thing that can happen to you. So I think, you know, I think in terms of the generals, I think that there are some things in there that are certainly worthy of debate and discussion, and I mean, I think you could read it and use it as part of a professional development program. But also, I think that there has been a great deal more accountability, you know, than he may realize. And frankly, I haven't read the whole book. I've read in the book. It's on my list to read, but I haven't read it. I've just read reviews, and I've read in it a little bit. But I think there are a lot of books that are coming out now on the war, on the wars in both Afghanistan and Iraq. I think if you want to understand the war in Afghanistan in broader historical perspective, there's a great book called The Wars of Afghanistan by Peter Thompson. Peter Thompson, it's like 890 pages or something. I mean, it's not beach reading maybe, but I mean but it reads really well, and you can move around in it and so forth. And I think that's the best one volume on that to understand the whole context. I think there's a really neat book that's just come out on Afghanistan on a tactical perspective, and Marines here I think would want to read this who've been in Helmand. It's by a British officer, and it's called War from the Ground Up. And it really gets to the political complexities at the local level and how you have to conduct military operations with the effect that those operations are going to have on what you're trying to achieve politically at the local level. And so I think those are two of the best books that have come out on Afghanistan recently. On Iraq, I think Endgame is going to be a comprehensive first cut at history for a long time. In some of the books that have come out, you know, there's this perception, you know, and this is something that maybe that we should all try to correct, is that, you know, there's always going to be debate. There's always going to be, I hope, open exchange of ideas within our military. And there's an idea now that if you are critical, in a positive way critical, of what's happening and offer your best assessment and recommendations in a respectful way, that you're somehow, you know, an insurgent or like an outlier or something, you know. I'll tell you, I mean, always in my career, I've found senior officers amenable to hearing frank assessments of what's happening and recommendations, you know. And I think if you do it in a respectful way, if you describe, you know, how the problem relates to what you're trying to achieve overall in your mission, and you have recommendations, you know, that's not undermining in any way or being insubordinate. I mean, that's what we do in the military, you know. So I think sometimes it's hard for people outside the military to understand that part of our culture, because obviously we're a culture that depends on discipline and so forth. But it's a discipline that encourages, you know, what in the Army and Marine Corps we call mission command, you know, decentralized operations based on mission orders, and that open communication up and down the chain. So.
Well, General McMaster, I will tell you, when we think about the brightest leaders in our country, we think of you, and I want to thank you for coming out here to talk tonight. And once again, if I could, a big hand for our Iraq and Afghanistan war veterans, including General McMaster. For all you war veteran, Afghanistan, Iraq war veterans, we have a little something for you here, and there's a table over here, and our Director of Special Projects, Ed Flowers, has put these together, and I hope you'll take one with you, because, and you'll treasure it and hang it on your I Love Me wall. I do have a little one for General McMaster to take away, and this actually is one we treasure. It's got the Iwo Jima stamp on it, and it thanks him for coming to talk. And it tells the story of the Iwo Jima stamp. But General McMaster, we thank you so much for coming out here, sir.